in any business, as the leader, you're expected to have all the knowledge and all of the understanding of every problem. And when you think about that, that can't possibly be the case.
Our next guest barely needs an introduction, as he has a job that everyone has an opinion on. Responsible not only for the spike in waistcoat sales, but for a dynamic young England team that reached the semi-finals of the 2018 World Cup, and has a good shot of this year's delayed Euro 2020s. Ladies and gentlemen, Gareth Southgate.
Good. How are you?
Thank you so much, Gareth, for sparing your time. I want to first start on just talk about kind of your leadership in a more general sense of the England side, because you're a young manager, but I think your leadership style is fair to say has been kind of widely and kind of universally praised. I want to talk to you about players' decision makings. You've said that you want players to speak up in meetings. What is the particular reasoning behind that, and what's an example of that with the England side?
I think when you're working with in any business, as the leader, you're expected to have all the knowledge and all of the understanding of every problem. And when you think about that, that can't possibly be the case. So whether it's with the players or with our other staff, I like to have an environment where people feel free to offer an opinion. There will be people in the room that have a better solution to problems than I've got. And part of the role, I think, of the leader is to bring all those ideas to the table, bring them out of people. People are often reluctant to speak in a group. People are often reluctant to challenge the thinking of the leader. So by enabling players to talk in meetings, that's what we're seeking, really. They're the guys that have to go on the pitch and play. We could have some really good ideas of what we think the game might look like or how the opponent might play. But if they're sitting in the room thinking, actually, I don't think this plan's got any hope of working, well, firstly, we're better to know that before they go on the pitch, rather than we just go through the motions and then it fails. And secondly, they'll have an insight on one of the opponents, an insight into a game they've played before in a similar situation. And the more we can share that thinking and share those ideas, the stronger we'll be as a team. So I personally think the days are gone where the manager of a business or of a team or the leader of an organisation was expected to know all the answers and ruled by fear or ruled by, I'm the boss, what I say goes. I just think we're into a different world now.
How do you foster that in young players particularly? Because I think we would imagine that someone like Harry Kane is someone not afraid to speak out. How do you get that mentality, though, to maybe the newer, younger members of the group?
I think it's quite interesting that I think young people coming through now, through school, through university, I think they're more prepared to have a say than perhaps we were when we were younger, or some of our guys that are in their late 20s. I think the youngsters are more confident, more self-confident, more aware of the whole world out there, more aware of their opportunity to use their voice for positive change.
Yeah.
So in some regards, it's actually some of the older ones we have to encourage a little bit more.
Really?
Well, it is, because I think they've been brought up in an environment of
a different mindset.
Yeah, and,
right.
in football, very often the boss is the boss, and
sure.
You call them the boss, you call them the gaffer. It's quite.
Who would be an example of that? Who are an older pro that you've almost needed to kind of coax out of that kind of mindset?
Well, I think all of them. I think all of them have been brought up in that world where they're respectful. But as I've said, even that terminology of calling the boss gaffer, it's very old-fashioned, and that doesn't sit naturally with me. In my head, that was always shown as a sign of respect, but it doesn't mean that you have respect for somebody. You know, I'm quite happy if they call me by my first name, or if they want to call me boss, fine. But I don't think they have less respect if they call me Gareth than they do boss. It's a nonsense, really.
Sure, as long as they don't call you Gary. Like. On that note, like, I'm genuinely interested. What do most of the England players call you? If there's not a set thing, some will call you Gaffer, some will call you Gareth.
Yeah, and I don't balk at either, really. I've been the same since I started as a manager. You know, I'm 50 now. I don't insist that there's this respect shown by what they might call me, because really that's a very temporary measure. It's a very shallow sign of respect, frankly. Sure. I've played in teams where everybody called the manager, you know, the boss, but, you know, when he left the changing room, they were calling him everything but. So it doesn't really mean anything in regards of how you're perceived. I think you're working as a team, and my view is that, there are decisions that as the leader you have to take, and there are decisions that as a group of staff you have to take, and there are some moments where you have to be seen to be saying, no, that's the route we're going, and I've made a decision, and that's what we're doing. But we're all working together. We all want the team to do well. We want the players to perform at the best possible level. But they also are desperate to win. They're desperate to improve. They're desperate to do well. So the idea that in their career they should have to wait for the guidance of a manager, or a manager to make the right decision on everything, I think is missing an opportunity to involve people and get the best out of people.
Yeah. Your England squad trained with the Royal Marines back in 2017 in preparation for the World Cup. What did they gain from that? And also, do you have something similar up your sleeves in advance of the Euros?
Well, really, that was the idea. One of our staff had worked with England Rugby years ago when they won the Rugby World Cup, and he'd been down to Lympstone to the Royal Marine Base with the rugby team. And it was a slightly left field, slightly risky decision, first of all because we knew that the clubs might not approve of that sort of move.
Did you have any pushback from any of the clubs?
Well, we didn't tell them at the time, but we were very clear on risk assessment that we weren't going to put the players into anything that, of course, you go through an assault course, you could turn an ankle or something, but the Marines operate on a very high level of risk, and they knew the athletes they were bringing in, so nobody wanted a drama in that regard. What did it give us? It pushed people out of their comfort zone. The lads camped out. Lots of them had never camped out before. It brought staff and players together in a different sort of environment. So, some of our older staff, I think, gained huge respect for really having a go at some of the physical challenges that the young lads looked at them slightly differently after that. But also it was just one small step on the path to showing another elite environment, an elite group of men who come together to represent their country. The consequences of failure far higher for them than they are for us. And so when we talk about pressure of playing for England, actually that really put context onto what real pressure is, and real responsibility. But young men of the same age, working together as a team, high standards, it was a good insight for our guys into a different environment. We now actually, very few of that squad are still with us because over a period of time, lots of changes, lots of younger players coming through. In terms of what we might do moving forward, I think those are difficult challenges for every sports team at the moment, because coaches around the world are trying to foster team building and team ethos, but without the possibility of actually going and physically working in different environments. We're so restricted on what we can do because of the rules around the virus. So you're having to be quite creative in terms of building an identity, building a team culture. So much has to happen on the pitch or in training sessions. You can't sit in meeting rooms for very long. We couldn't do what we did with the Marines, for example, in the same way. So I think all coaches are finding that a real challenge at this time.
I want to get on to COVID, actually, just because I think earlier you were saying that curiously, one of the advantages when you're now watching a game is that by the lack of crowd, you can hear the communication between the players more. So it's not like we're trying to find an upside in a pandemic, but that's an interesting knock-on effect for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about the sort of artificial crowd noise that the television companies put on. And other than the fact that I walk in a room, I hear that, I think I'm watching my son play FIFA or whatever, I just find it more insightful as a coach to be able to listen to the communication of the players, to see who are the organisers, to see who are the leaders, because I think now more than ever that communication on the pitch, when you haven't got the fans to lift the team or to help the team through the moments of difficulty on the field, to have that leadership on the field and to have experienced players who are helping to get the best out of others is a really critical component of the team. And with the crowd, of course, when you're suffering as a team, the crowd can give you that huge lift. Now that's got to come from within the team. So I think good communicators, good leadership on the field is more important than ever before.
And have you seen how players react differently to there not being a crowd?
Yeah, I think if you spoke to all coaches, again, in all sports, they would say some people are suffering a little bit from that, because I think the top players, when I started as a young player, the crowd maybe inhibited me a bit. You felt the pressure, you felt a little bit more expectation. And I think you're seeing young players who are able to thrive because there's no crowd. They can try things. If mistakes happen, you don't get the groan from the terrace. You don't get that instant reaction. The only reaction you get is later on social media. So if you can avoid that, during the game, actually, there's a bit more freedom. But then players that have played for longer, the crowd is a huge motivation and gives you an additional energy and gives you the adrenaline that brings the very best performance out of you. So I think for the more experienced players, that's more of a challenge. And I have to say, I think that's why we're seeing a lot of performances, if you look at the league, where it's difficult to get the consistency of performance. So much going on in everybody's lives, so much unique about the build-up to a game. Sometimes the team are in two separate dressing rooms. Staff are having to wear masks. You're having meetings with players with masks on. You go into the stadium, there's no crowd. People are dealing with so much with their families as well. That has to affect everybody's performance on the pitch. And we're seeing some real random results and some really incredible scorelines as well.
Yeah. I'm interested, does that affect your thoughts as England manager when you think of that young players coming in, possibly making their debuts, aren't going to be under that same pressure from the crowd? Mm-hmm. Does it almost make you think, well, actually, this might be a good time to, because your tenure as England manager has been defined by kind of bringing the youth through, but does it almost make you think now that this is a good time to maybe blood some young players to give players their first caps?
Yeah, I don't think that's changed our thought process that much, in that we have right the way through recognised there are some good young players coming through internationally, and we felt the right thing to do was to try to blood them. We know that successful international teams have accumulated quite a lot of caps in big games as they've gone forward, so to be able to put young players in early who we think are going to be good enough to have success internationally is a real plus. I think now there is this added element of, okay, maybe if we're playing a player in an away fixture, there's one less thing for them to deal with. I still think there's still huge pressure when you play for England. Cool. It's a different level of scrutiny to club. You're judged very much on that 90 minutes. Nobody's thinking about the previous 5 matches you had or the next 5. At a club level, there's more allowance for those slight fluctuations in performance. With England, you play 2 or 3 times in a month, 10, 12 times in a year. The scrutiny on every one of those performances is at a much higher level, and for any player, that's a huge challenge, really.
Mm. What do you think about the recent trend, or reasonably recent trend, I suppose, of young English players going to the Bundesliga? I mean, obviously, someone like Jadon Sancho is a player that has become a superstar out there by playing for Dortmund. But there's a younger player that maybe a lot of people won't know about called Jude Bellingham, who's out there. He's breaking records as their youngest ever, goal scorer and assist maker and various things. A young midfielder. Do you see it as England manager that you're happy they're out there playing games? Do you think it's a shame they've almost felt they've had to go there to get games? Where do you stand?
There are different ways for young players to develop. They definitely develop on the training pitch. So training with good players, working with good coaches, that's one aspect of development. But in the end, they have to go and play matches and competitive matches. So the beauty of the Bundesliga is that the level of the league is the top teams, obviously Bayern, Dortmund would be in the top half of the Premier League for sure, and in the top 6 potentially, certainly Bayern obviously would. But then there are this range of matches as you go through that is probably not quite as competitive right the way through the league as the Premier League. And so for young players, it's a very good league to develop in. There are lots of young players playing throughout the league. Tactically, it's a high level. Athletically, it's a high level. But you're still getting, in different times, at Dortmund playing in front of 80,000 fans. So the pressure, the expectation is there of playing for a big club. But the range of fixtures is probably a really nice bridge for young players to go and play.
And the way you describe it there, it sort of almost sounds ideal.
Yeah, well, I think it is. And the other aspect is that historically we haven't had players travel abroad to play. And I think as people, if we're talking about developing people, the experience of going abroad, learning a language, having to adapt to a new environment, helps to make them a more rounded person, and in the end that will help you as a player. So we've had a few guys go there on loan to other clubs. Not all of those have been successful. Jadon is the obvious example that has been a success. Jude has started really well. But I think the more players that travel abroad and play, the better. The rest of Europe have always done that. Very often their league hasn't been able to support the better players, the smaller countries, Croatia, Portugal, Belgium, they've exported their players. So their own league is full of their best young players. Their better players then go and play either in Serie A or the Bundesliga or the Premier League or La Liga. We haven't done that, and we've probably suffered as a consequence of that, in that our players weren't exposed to different tactical requirements and to, as I say, those life experiences that help to improve you as a person.
The Euros, they're still called the Euro 2020s, but they are being played in 2021. Looked at from a purely football perspective, will it be better to have played them a year later? Because I think Harry Kane last time would have just been coming off the back of an injury. You have the emergence of Phil Foden playing more regularly now for Man City. You have Jack Grealish in great form. From just a purely football perspective, has it benefited England?
Yeah, I think there's a balance to all of those things. So definitely we are a young squad. So another year of football, playing big matches, will help a lot of our squad. There's no question about that. And we're not at a point where any of our older players will be too old. The flip side of that is we'll be going into the tournament on the back of the most intense, physically intense season ever. Very short end of season break, very minimal pre-season, and a fixture list that's been condensed and crammed into a 10-month period. So I think we have 3 weeks between the last league game and the first game of the Euros, so a week less preparation. If any of our teams get to the Champions League final, then they would have another week. So it's going to be physically a different sort of challenge, monitoring the players through the season. There are going to be a lot of inconsistencies. There are going to be a lot of injuries. So most countries are going to be in the same situation, and the countries that adapt the best will be the ones that are successful. But there are pros and cons to what we're going to have experienced this season, I think, ahead of a big tournament.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the Euros won't go ahead? Because I'm just thinking that we're in the middle or on the cusp of a second wave at the moment. I know there was a Champions League game the other night where I think 9 of their players had COVID, and they had to call up kids to play. Is it a concern, or are you confident?
I'm confident that the Euros will go ahead. The format of that tournament has to be open to change, I think, because we don't quite know where we'll be. It's a reality. I know that it would be easy to say, oh yeah, we're super confident, but the reality of the world at the moment is none of us know what we'll be doing in 3 or 4 days' time, or what we'll be allowed to do in 3 or 4 days' time. And absolutely, whenever we're getting the team together, we're tested 3 or 4 times within a week, because we have to be tested before every match. And you just don't know if you might lose a player or 3 players to that testing regime at the drop of a hat. So I'm sure that there will be contingency plans. There's a possibility the Euros goes in the format it is, and there are crowds in. But then I think it would be naive not to be thinking there is a chance we won't have crowds in, or we'll have smaller crowds in. Or the format of the tournament in different host cities might look different. So I don't say that from any sort of insight into what's going on with UEFA, but I'm just saying that as a common sense view of what we seem to be experiencing throughout the world, frankly.
Yeah. It was recently the 1-year anniversary of the England versus Bulgaria game, which is obviously where we saw some horrific scenes of black English players being racially abused. What do you remember about that night, looking back? What do you remember about your decision making?
Well, we had spent a lot of time preparing for that situation. Unfortunately, we were aware that there had been instances of racism in Bulgaria previously, and we'd experienced an evening in Montenegro where towards the end of the game we became more aware of things that had been happening to the players that the players had picked up earlier in the game, and we weren't aware of that as a management team during the game.
Can I ask what kind of things?
Yeah, so a couple of the players were racially abused during the game by supporters in Montenegro. We weren't aware of that until close to the end of the game when we heard things. And of course, sometimes the media, who are sitting in the stand and not having to focus as much on the game as we are, will maybe hear things or that you might not when you're engrossed in the game. So anyway, we felt that we hadn't necessarily been able to get the right response in Montenegro, and we wanted to be prepared for what might happen in Bulgaria. So we talked with the players about it before we went out there. Again, there's a balance there of not wanting to put fear into the players, because that's not a situation that anybody wanted to be involved in. The players want the story to be about football, and they want to be judged as players, and they're reticent to be the centre of a political story. Equally, we know the power, the message that comes from us, and how that can affect and improve things in a wider society. So is a moment of huge responsibility, really. Not a moment any of us wanted to live through. But we were very clear that there were protocol we felt it was correct to follow. We felt that it was most important that all of the players felt supported, that they knew we were together on whatever we were going to do. And if we weren't happy that the protocol was having an effect on the night, then ultimately we would follow it to the letter, and we would come off the pitch. Now, there are a couple.
So to be clear, that means you were prepared to abandon the game. Then that was something that you had set in your mind that you were willing to do beforehand.
Yeah, and during the first half of the game, I have to say, we weren't confident that we would get to the end,
right?
Because the game had stopped once. It stopped again just before half time. The players wanted to get to half time, so we talked with them during the game. And at half time, we had a chance to regroup, to discuss how everybody felt about things. Of course, even within that, although I think we dealt sympathetically with the players, that would still have been very difficult for some of the players to say, actually, we want to come off now, because in the end, again, they're the centre of the story. So had we felt there was a point to go over what they felt was right, we would have done that. But in the second half, the core of fans who'd been creating the biggest problem had been ejected from the stadium or had left the stadium, so it was a different environment. I know some accounts of that night have claimed there were still incidents in the second half. That wasn't clear to the players, and that wasn't clear to us on the touchline. It's, again, very difficult when you're engrossed in the game to hear the exact content of everything. Some of the chanting in the first half was very clear to us, and we knew. In the second half, we didn't feel that, and the players were wrapped up in the game. They felt, I think, well supported, but of course that's for them to speak for themselves. Not a situation we ever want to experience again. And I think we also know that to go along those steps in the future probably wouldn't be acceptable. That was the first time that had been done, and it felt like the right thing to do. Yeah. But I don't think any of us are really up for, sitting there allowing people to be abusive.
Of course.
For 3 steps, and then we finally walk off. I think there would probably be a different view of that in the future.
Yeah, and just finally, I think everyone is excited about the Euros. I think everyone's excited about this England team, and certainly an attack. I think when you look at our attacking options, I think everyone's very excited about that. What would you regard success as?
So it's a really good question, because when we went to the World Cup, we talked about making the country proud, and we knew to do that, firstly, we'd have to win matches, because it doesn't matter how you represent the country. If you're not winning games as a football team, you're in trouble, really. So first and foremost, you have to progress and you have to win matches. But we also wanted to represent the country in a way that brought the country together. And we're going through a difficult period. Every country is. We obviously only have eyes on our own country. The pandemic has, unfortunately, from a point where it felt like everybody was pulling together, everybody was understanding, supporting the NHS, and we're now in a different place where there's the fatigue of dealing with this situation. There's now different lockdowns for different regions. There are different industries that are suffering in different ways. Incredibly difficult situation for government to deal with, incredibly difficult situation for the whole population to deal with. But we would hope that the team next summer can start to bring people together again. That always feels more difficult during the season, actually, because the tribal nature of club football rules during the season, and the international matches are almost an inconvenience to people, and we're having to bring the team together, work in very short bursts, cram fixtures into an ever congested fixture list. But I know when the tournaments come, everybody sort of puts that club rivalry to one side and then comes together for England, and that will happen again next summer. we are still a team that we were the second youngest team in the World Cup, and we're actually younger still now. You know, we played Belgium a few weeks ago. We had 5 players 23 and under. In international terms, that's still a very inexperienced team, both in terms of age and caps. So we're still on a journey of improving and learning. We know that we've been able to beat some of the best teams in the world on a one-off. What we've got to add is that consistency, and you know, the desire of the players and all of the staff is there. And we know we'll continue to improve, and there are some really exciting players that are going to be outstanding for England moving forward. Whether next summer is going to be that moment is for us to go and prove on the pitch.
Right. Gareth Southgate, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.